Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and today's material is on child development. And right off the bat, I gotta say, this is maybe the most complicated, difficult material to lecture on because everyone knows someone with a mental illness, everyone knows someone who's been depressed or something, and it always seems a little bit distant. But child development is the most personal thing I can talk about. Everyone's been a child, and most of you listening to this will either soon have children, have them already. And so almost nothing you can talk about in the field of child development doesn't go right to the listener's heart, sometimes in ways that are quite painful. So I ask you, as you're listening through this material, take a deep breath and realize that it's not personal, that it's absolutely of central importance that we talk about things at a fundamental enough level for them to be meaningful. When that happens, however, it's almost inevitable that the material covered will evoke in you quite powerful feelings, like, is there a right way to do a certain type of child rearing? Well, you might think so. You may have been trained in a particular culture in a particular time and place, and you might have very strong feelings about how to raise children. I don't know anyone that doesn't have strong feelings, and I am going to rely as best I can on what science has shown my field over the last 100 years to be the developmental needs of the children. That's the phrase I'm going to use probably repeatedly. What are the honest, real, developmental needs of a child? How do we think about those things? And I have to admit up front that I am likely to say things that cause a great deal of anxiety and frustration and possibly even anger in some of the listeners. I can't help that. There's no way to help that. And so we just have to gear up a little bit and deal with very difficult material as best we can. One of the authors who I find most important in this field is a woman named Alice Miller. And I apologize for reading 3 paragraphs, not the best lecture technique, but this is so important I want to get it word for word right. I think she sets the stage as well or better than anyone I've ever read. This is the opening lines from her book, The Drama of the Gifted Child. Experience has taught us that we have only one enduring weapon in our struggle against mental illness, the emotional discovery of the truth about the unique history of our childhood. Is it possible, then, to free ourselves altogether from illusions? History demonstrates that they sneak in everywhere, that every life is full of them, perhaps because the truth often seems unbearable to us. And yet the truth is so essential that its loss exacts a heavy toll in the form of grave illness. In order to become whole, we must try in a long process to discover our own personal truth, a truth that may cause pain before giving us a new sphere of freedom. If we choose instead to content ourselves with intellectual wisdom, we will remain in the sphere of illusion and self-deception. The damage done to us during our childhood cannot be undone, since we cannot change anything in our past. We can, however, change ourselves. We can repair ourselves and gain our lost integrity by choosing to look more closely at the knowledge that is stored inside our bodies and bringing this knowledge closer to our awareness. This path, although certainly not easy, is the only route by which we can at last leave behind the cruel, invisible prison of our childhood. We become free by transforming ourselves from unaware victims of the past into responsible individuals in the present who are aware of our past and are thus able to live with it. Here's the problem, as she just nails. Most people do exactly the opposite. Without realizing that the past is constantly determining their present actions, they avoid learning anything about their history. They continue to live in their repressed childhood situation, ignoring the fact that it no longer exists. They are continuing to fear and avoid dangers that, although once were real, have not been real for a long time. They are driven by unconscious memories and by repressed feelings and needs that determine nearly everything they do or fail to do. And that's the end of the quote. This information is about parents as well as children. All of us, really. Not just child development and not just parent development. I think this is human development across the board. And I hope as the lectures unfold, you will learn as much about yourself now, however old you are, as you will about the proper needs, the proper way to handle the needs of a child. Now, the second problem with child development lectures is that the field has been going on for over 100 years, and it is astonishingly rich, and there are dozens of theoretical paradigms, and it is almost impossible to synthesize anything down to a manageable group of lectures. So with apologies to all of those theorists I'm leaving out, some selection has to be made. The bulk of the material comes from Margaret Mahler, Melanie Klein, Erik Erikson, the new and growing field of behavioral genetics, and also the not quite so new, but also growing field of neurophysiology, and many others. Again, given the synthesis of all those different fields, the question will remain, what are the needs of the child? And again, without beating this to death or exaggerating it too much, I want to focus consistently on what science has shown us to be the answer to that question, and caution us all again to sort of take a deep breath. And I'll just come right out and say it at this point. There's going to be disagreements that are based on culture, and the simple fact is not all cultures are equal when it comes to child development. This culture that we're in now, the American culture, has swung from one extreme to the other, it seems, and that at the end of the day, the only answer to the question, what are the child's legitimate developmental needs, can only be answered by science, clinical observation, and a lot of very difficult hard work. I will go against tradition. I will go against cultural norms. And my only recourse is to the data of science. I hope that's enough. Child development has to begin with Freud, because before Freud there was no theory of child development. Perhaps his greatest innovation was the idea that children develop through stages. It seems clear looking at the literature prior to Freud that no one thought that way, that people, for the most part, thought children were just little humans who hadn't grown up yet. And it was Freud's, again, one of his greatest innovations to imagine and think about and reconstruct his adult patients' childhoods, recognizing that they went through very specific phases, that at certain ages they had developmental needs that were different at later stages, and that these stages, and this is the critical point, built on each other, that unless you traversed one stage adequately, it was very difficult to traverse the next one, so things built on themselves. A snowball began rolling in effect, and if you didn't get it right off the beginning, right at the beginning, then it became very difficult to catch up or make up for earlier mistakes. So since Freud and his paradigm of child development, which I've given in a previous lecture and I will not reiterate now, dozens of different theorists have sliced and diced childhood development in a variety of ways, using different names for different phases, characterizing the phases differently. And I'm not going to choose one over the other. The fundamental idea is of phases of development. That remains unquestioned in my field. There aren't very many things in the field of psychology that everyone agrees on. I think I can say that at the very least, phases of child development are now universally agreed on, if the specifics are still argued about. The most innovative, the most recent development in child development is the discovery of what is, I think, most generally known as fetal origins. Freud started with the foundation of what he called the Oedipus complex, the nuclear complex, as he called it, from 3.5 to 5 years. He recognized that child development prior to that was important, and something important was going on, but he wasn't quite sure what it was. And he frankly didn't study it very hard or very long. He couldn't go back any farther dealing with adult patients. It took his daughter Anna Freud and Melanie Klein and Margaret Mahler and their followers and subsequent researchers to recognize that the key developmental issues were not starting at 3.5 or 4 years, that they actually came quite a bit before that. The key developmental ideas up until recently have been from birth on. You've got to get infancy handled correctly, or you'll never get to the Oedipus complex, much less healthy adult or adolescent learning, or the rest of those things. So in the last 30 or 40 years, I think we can say Freud's developmental phases have been backed up all the way to birth. Well, it shouldn't surprise anybody, and it didn't really surprise me when Time magazine on its cover, one of its covers last year, highlighted what they called the first 9 months, which meant conception to birth. And it turns out that most researchers now, and this is brand new, we're not sure where all this is going or the specifics of it yet, but I think in just the last 10 years, there have been literally dozens of prenatal research programs begun that attempt to track the conditions of the pregnant mother, the conditions of the fetus, and then in a longitudinal way track their development to adulthood and figure out if there are consistencies in the pregnant mother's experience that result in developmental tracks being taken or not being taken, developmental problems that can be developed, if we can see a certain series of things happening during pregnancy. And it appears that childhood development is now being recognized as beginning at conception or shortly thereafter. A couple of the basic questions. What is the mother's nutrition like? What is her environment? Are there pollutants around? Toxins? What is the status of her body's tolerance or use of various drugs, prescription or otherwise? What is the general status of the mother's physical health? What types of stresses are she under? What we now see very clearly is that stress generates hormones, which the fetus is awash in inside the mother's uterus. What is the nature, and this is the tricky one and the potentially most troubling one, what is the status of the mother's mental health during pregnancy? It seems that most of the researchers are suggesting that the mother has a relationship to the baby in utero, long before birth. I've never met a pregnant woman yet who at some point during pregnancy, as early as 4 and 5 months sometimes, certainly after that didn't feel like there was a presence, a psychic presence, an emotional presence inside them that they felt a connection to, the ability to talk to feel emotional resonance with. I think most women who have been pregnant would agree that something like that is going on. That sounds like a necessary and good thing in building the rapport, the connection, the relationship of the mother to the infant when it's born. If the mother's mental health situation precludes that kind of connection, if the mother's circumstances, stress, difficulties, traumas preclude that kind of development, we have a situation where one might reasonably expect that the fetus will be in distress itself, and that generates developmental complications that we're just now beginning to try to understand. One of the more recent research findings is that conditions in the womb, conditions in terms of the mother's health, will have an effect on the wiring of the brain. What's fascinating is now, with all of the CAT scans, PET scans, functional MRIs, all of the brain scan technologies, we're now having apparently possibilities of doing fetal brain scanning and infant brain scanning, and we can see now, we have some research basis for suggesting that the conditions in the womb have a type of direct linkage to brain development postnatally. In terms of susceptibility to disease, to simple things like appetite, the child's metabolism, possibly even intelligence and temperament. These lines of research are now being formulated suggesting some kind of significant connection between the developmental trajectory of the fetus in the womb and the baby's life outside the womb after birth. We don't know where this is going. It's still premature, and I think the literature now is just starting to firm up. But in some ways, it makes logical sense scientifically. If most of the big research projects of the last 50 years have increasingly brought us back to the increasingly seen importance of the earliest periods postnatally, it shouldn't surprise anyone, and I don't think it does, that there are potentially at least, profound impacts prenatally on the fetus. And I think the take-home lesson here is we all know that the mother's relationship to the child is the most important thing for the child's development. How much more obvious is that when the fetus is quite literally connected, enveloped, in fact, by the mother's body? Everything happening to the mother physiologically and emotionally is simultaneously happening to the fetus. It seems to make sense, and I suspect this line of research will ultimately show conclusively that we now need to think about child development virtually from conception on. So, now moving on, there has been a recent book written by Doctors Brazelton and Greenspan. It's called The Irreducible Needs of Children. And I'm grateful to the authors for summarizing virtually the entire field, the last 50, 60 years of research on exactly the question that I think is the most important in developmental psychology and specifically child development. They have 6 things that they have listed as essential, irreducible needs of the children. And I don't think they are just being sort of metaphorical here. I think what they're suggesting in their fine text is that without these needs being met, the direct result is going to be some form of mental illness in the young child or the adolescent or young adult that child becomes. And let me summarize them, because I think this sets the stage for everything that comes after. Virtually every patient I have in my clinical practice, it is not that hard to trace back their conflict, their difficulty, their illness, back to one of these failures in their earlier childhood. Number 1, ongoing nurturing relationships. And that they say, every baby needs a warm, intimate relationship with a primary caregiver over a period of years, not months or weeks. This is far more important to emotional and intellectual development than early cognitive training or educational games. If this relationship is absent or interrupted, a child can develop disorders of reasoning, motivation, and attachment. Infants, toddlers, and preschools need these nurturing interactions most of their waking hours. This is going to shock and dismay a lot of people. It turns out that the first and most profound requirement for a baby is a present mother. There's no way around this. This is science now. It seems to me the literature supports it. Needs a mother. The take-home lesson here is not daycare, not a relationship, not a relation, a grandmother, an aunt, an uncle, a friend, someone who takes the child for several hours a day. In some circumstances, we understand that that's going to be inevitable, but what's important here is that we have to recognize that it's going to be a developmental problem in many, if not most cases. The truth of child development, respect for the child's development, requires that we look at policies from the perspective of the needs of the child, not the needs of the parents. I'm perilously close to offending people who have children in daycare. I understand that. I understand how difficult it is. I understand how complicated people's lives are. But Dr. Brazelton's research, which is supported by every bit of research I've reviewed, suggests that the number 1 irreducible need of a child is an ongoing nurturing relationship with a present, healthy, appropriate mother. Other things in addition to that, but that's the first one, and as much of it as possible throughout the childhood years. Number 2, physical protection, safety, and regulation, both in the womb, even they're referencing the prenatal research now, both in the womb and in infancy. Children need an environment that provides protection from physical and psychological harm, chemical toxins, and exposure to violence. What they're suggesting, plain and simple, is that our lives, the lives of most of our children, are way too chaotic. That what the child needs, in addition to a loving, committed, central relationship, is peace and safety, security and stability. One shouldn't be surprised at that, and it shouldn't be too much to ask. Number 3, experiences tailored to individual differences. Every child has a unique temperament. Tailoring early experience to nurture a child's individual nature prevents learning and behavioral problems and enables a child to develop his or her full potential. This is, I think, a reference to an older pediatrician who turned into a psychoanalyst, a man who worked with babies and mother for 20 years before he began psychological training, a man named Donald Winnicott. And he came up with this idea of the true self as opposed to the false self. And I think that's what they're referencing here, that each individual child, if given the right nurturing environment, will spontaneously generate a true self. And when that environment is not conducive to the growth of that true self, a defensive false self is built up. A defensive false self designed to defend against the terrible anxiety of an impinging environment that makes demands on the child instead of nurturing the child's fundamental needs. Number 4, developmentally appropriate experiences. Children of different ages need care tailored to their stage of development. Unrealistic expectations can hinder a child's development. This may be an indirect criticism of the parents who are trying too hard. The neglectful ones or the abusive ones, it's quite easy to identify them. The more complicated situation sometimes is when parents are so driven themselves to achieve, so perhaps one throws around pathological terms with some care, but so narcissistic that they demand that their children excel so that they can feel better about being super parents. The problem with that is it actually damages the child as often as not. It's about the parents' needs, not the children's needs, and therefore generates problems. We must encourage our children to become all they can be, to use the phrase, but the simple truth is we have to tailor those inspirational opportunities for their needs, not make them comply with our expectations. Number 5, limit setting, structure, and expectations. Children need structure and discipline. I don't think anybody doubts that anymore. They need discipline that leads to internal limit setting. Now, this is the hard part. They need discipline from parents who themselves are disciplined. It will not do any good to tell a child what to do when the parent themselves can't do it in their own adult lives. Disciplining a child is easy. Disciplining them in a way that meets the child needs is very hard for the parent because it isn't what you say, it's what you do. The children learn by taking in the example, the emotional resonance. And if the discipline comes from a place of anger, hostility, frustration, fear, anxiety, and not devotion and love of the child and their needs, then the discipline is going to derail the child's development, not assist it. They go on. They need discipline that leads to internal limit setting, channeling of aggression, and peaceful problem solving. Channeling of aggression, not its extirpation, not eliminating it. Children, human beings, are aggressive creatures. We evolved that way, or God put us here that way. Anyone with 5 minutes of review of history knows humans are naturally, instinctively, genetically aggressive creatures. To take that away from us is to emotionally castrate us. We will be aggressive. We have to be. The question is, what do we do with it? Can it be channeled to creativity? Can it be channeled to creative work? That's the kind of management of aggression children need from sane, careful, responsible adults. To reach this goal, they need adults who empathize as well as set limits. They need expectations rather than labels, and adults who believe in their potential but understand their weaknesses. They need incentive systems, not failure models. I think that speaks for itself. Number 6, and finally, stable, supportive communities and culture. To feel whole and integrated, children need to grow up in a stable community. This means a continuity of values in family, peer groups, religion, and culture. This one, I think, is the most neglected. Our culture has become chaotic. Our families are breaking up. The divorce rates are through the roof, and few now seem to be raised in traditional homes. One of the things that the authors have noticed is a statistically significant increase in developmentally related problems in children of divorce, in children of broken homes, in children of single parents. there is no denying the fact now, the federal statistics are conclusive on the matter, that children with chaotic childhoods do not develop as well as they might. So the last thing that is needed is stability. We'll talk more about that later. So what I'd like to do now is walk you through what's probably the most respected and also most well-researched paradigm of early child development. This is the research results developed by Margaret Mahler and her co-workers. And the way she describes it is the psychological birth of the human infant. A brief explanation of that. Everybody knows when you're born, you're human, we're all human. Once we're born, we can argue about whether we're human before we're born, but that's another day. The simple fact is we don't have any question, politics notwithstanding, we don't have any question about whether we're human when we're born. We are. And when are we fully human? When are we psychologically born? Because a 2-day-old infant is not a human being in the psychological sense I'm talking about. They don't have a sense of their own identity. They cannot think in language. They are a complicated little proto-organism. They have a lot of things going on in their little minds, but it is opaque to us for the most part. We can't see inside their minds. They can't tell us what's going on. And it's very difficult to look inside an infant's mind and figure out what's going on. But that's in fact what Mahler and her researchers have been trying to do for 30 or 40 years. They've spent literally years sitting with babies and mothers, watching them, taking notes, tracking development of individuals, tracking groups of individuals. And this is how they think development happens. And I will, after the Mahler material, describe some object relational conclusions that we've been able, I think, to, in a very useful way, describe what's going on in a baby's mind. Now, we don't know, this is where science gets a little weak. We can observe clinically, but we do not have the ability to look inside the mind of a child and accurately take it apart and put it back together like it's a car engine. That we cannot do, fortunately, I think. So, while I'm a big fan of hard science, while I respect the physicists and the mathematicians and the biologists, the simple truth is psychology does not go that far down the road toward hard science. The best we can do is this clinical observation and theory development out of, quite literally, endless clinical observation. That's the best we have now. If someone can come up with a better idea, I'm all ears. This is the result of 50 or 60 years worth of exactly that sort of observation. So, the growth process of the psychological birth of the human infant. The first thing she realized, Margaret Mahler, is that these stages of development don't have very clear boundaries. I think that's why, since Freud, it seems like every other developmental psychologist has come up with their own series of stages, given them new names, sliced and diced the child's developmental years in different ways. And I think that fact, if you step back and look at it a little more broadly, simply means that there's more continuity in the child's development than there is clean and clear stages that at 2 months and 3 weeks and 4 days, we can say, aha, they're in the next stage. It doesn't work that way. These stages are really heuristic devices, training devices, teaching devices that therapists and teachers use to help us make sense of masses of data. Please do not misunderstand a theory for reality. The theories, and this is true across the board in all of these psychology lectures, a theory, if it's useful, then we should use it to make sense of our world and our minds. But it is not being put forward as some sort of absolute truth. Even when I've suggested science says X, we are open to better research, we're open to deeper learning and truths based on better science down the road. I certainly hope that's forthcoming. If I give these lectures again in 10 or 15 years, I certainly hope they are radically different as we learn more things. This is the best we have. And so I'm pitching what I think is the best theory. It represents the best science, but it absolutely isn't being presented as some sort of final absolute truth in development. That we do not have and probably never will. Okay, so we're blending boundaries, and Margaret Moeller, and I think maybe more so Melanie Klein, saw the human mind as an accumulation of experiences. An accumulation of experiences in the child's environment, and this is critically important, combined with the genetic potentials that every human has as soon as the egg is fertilized with the sperm. That we have two things going on here simultaneously. And if there's one huge innovation in modern developmental psychology, it's that no one with more than 10 minutes of review of the literature in the field ever suggests that any human behavior is caused by genetics or the environment alone. You see it on the news all the time. It makes a great headline. It has nothing to do with psychology or development. School shooter must have a bad gene, or his mother must have dropped him on his head too many times, or his mother must not have loved him enough. It is impossible. There has never been a single case of anyone on this planet tying in some direct causal way a single event in childhood with a specific human adolescent or adult behavior. It's never happened. It's never going to happen because the human mind isn't put together that way. I think Klein and Moeller were correct. The human mind is the slow accumulation, the slow developmental process of both life's experiences taken in and the unfolding of genetic potential. And the best researchers now are confirming over and over that any human behavior is always a combination. And I think it's even deeper than that. What we see now from earliest child development is that the genetic potential itself is determined in part by the environment. A baby who is loved well, and cared for well, has a different brain structure than one that's been neglected and abandoned. In simple fact, love makes your brain grow. And simultaneously, without an adequate environment, the potential for biological growth is stymied. It takes both of these things. No matter what the environment, if you have blue eyes as a child, you're going to have blue eyes as an adult. There are certain things the environment can't change. There are certain potentialities that are genetically encoded. That's true as well. And what we see is this incredibly complex interactive matrix of genetic and environment. And so in terms of child development now, we must look at both of those things as carefully as we can and simply accept the immense complexity of human adult behavior. No linear causation. We must look at a snowball and it's like trying to tease apart which snowflake is which inside a snowball. You can't do it. Same thing in terms of child development. The conclusion is simply this: genes and environments always interact together. No way to tease them apart. And here's probably the most complicated part of this complicated subject. We're going to talk about babies and infants who can't speak, who do not have any language skill. We're going to be using words, we're going to be using language to describe pre-linguistic experience. The baby has no words. The baby can't tell us what's going on. We have to infer that and describe it to our students and patients and each other in language. So we must always be a little bit humble about claiming that we've discovered something in language that is inevitably inadequate to the task. The baby's experience, their emotional feeling states are what they are. Our ability to describe them in language will inevitably be quite inadequate to the task. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We have to try, because this is the problem that we're struggling with. In order to understand what the needs of the child are, we have to put it in language as best we can. So let's walk through briefly what Margaret Mahler's researchers have suggested are the fundamental developmental stages of an infant's psychological birth. The first one is birth to 2 months, and she calls it the autistic phase, and immediately we're in a language problem. Autism, it's been in the news a lot lately. I will spend a great deal of time in the lecture on psychopathology on the pathologies of childhood. We'll address autism then. But autistic phase sounds like there's something mentally ill with babies, which is ridiculous. What she meant by that poor choice of language, is a normal phase of development, birth to 2, wherein the child is assumed to be wholly contained within itself. Its sense of self is internal. It does not see, does not understand external others, other relationships, other people. It doesn't know what a people is. It doesn't tell it it can't tell the difference between self and mother or self and other. And so it's within its own little world. There are disputes about that, but that was Margaret Mahler's first understanding of the earliest, just 2 months after birth. Again, I don't think it's a particularly meaningful debate. It's raged for 30 years. Is a baby, birth to 2 months, wholly within its own experience, or is it in some ways object-related, seeking objects outside itself? Theoretically, we can argue that all day. The simple truth is a baby needs a mother. A baby cannot exist without a mother. D.W. Winnicott, that great pediatrician who became an analyst, was one of the most respected child developmental researchers in the world in the 40s and 50s, up to the 60s. And he came out one day in a lecture, was going to address a bunch of psychoanalysts and experts and folks focused on child development. And he started his lecture, and he was held in very high esteem. People thought he was very bright and knew lots of stuff. And he walked to the podium, looked at everyone, held their eyes for a minute, and began by saying, "There is no such thing as a baby," and was silent for a minute or so. And it made everybody nervous. And why is he silent? And what did he say? Wait a minute. There's no such thing as a baby. Well, of course there's such a... I have one. I have a baby. And then after the nervous laughter sort of reached a certain peak, he stopped and smiled and he said, "There's no such thing as a baby alone. There is only a baby and a mother together. A baby alone is unimaginable and could not survive." And I think that was his point, that whether a baby theoretically is connected to an external object or not is irrelevant. A baby, in order to survive, must have a mother. And that turns out to be literally true. At the end of World War II, during World War II in London, with the bombings, many parents were killed, and there was babies that were orphaned. And so the British government, responding responsibly, even during wartime, took all these babies together to a safe hospital to the north of England. And there was approximately 150 of them, babies, from birth to just a few days or weeks, months old. And they lined them all up in bassinets, and they were well fed and cared for and cleaned and medically checked and safe. And within 6 months, half of them died. And they didn't know why. And once the research happened, and once some fairly bright folks looked at the data, they concluded, quite terribly in fact, it seems, that they died of loneliness and broken hearts. They could not live without a mother there, and they were well cared for in their bassinets, but they weren't held, they weren't cooed at, they weren't nurtured and rocked. They were simply kept in a very efficient, very clean, very well-tended baby warehouse, effectively. And they died, half of them. And one assumes that the other half that survived were traumatized by the experience. So, autism as a developmental phase or not, what seems clear, what the literature and sadly history suggests, is that the first order of business is the baby and its relationship to the mother. How should a mother and father handle the transition? What happens right after birth? Well, a couple of things. Freud was right about this. that the postnatal life of the child should be as seamless as humanly possible with the prenatal life. Think about it from the baby's perspective. A baby in a mother's womb is warm. It's dark. There isn't much noise, and what they hear primarily is the rhythmic beat of the mother's heart. It's incredibly soothing. Most people know when they have a baby that a rhythmic noise soothes the baby. Some parents claim that either a kitchen fan, the sound of a car engine, the beating of a clock, some rhythmic sound will put a fussy baby in a state of soothing rest rather quickly. And the reason is obvious. It reflects to them a sense of peace and security of the womb. So that is why babies aren't impinged on by loud noise, by rock and roll music, by doors slamming, by bright lights. We keep the baby's existence as close to the prenatal life as possible. Soothing, soft voices, warmth, dim lights. Then they can transition. And I tell students all the time, folks, we don't appreciate the trauma that birth is to the child. If I could transport you to the most alien world imaginable, the differential between your life and that life would not be as great as the baby's transition from prenatal to postnatal life. What an alien environment the poor baby is thrown into, not to mention the birth of trauma itself. And so please, recognizing that, the needs of the child must be for a transition, a slow transition. As Freud said, attempt a seamless transition from pregnancy to postnatal life. What's happening to the mother just before birth and a little bit after? Winnicott, again innovatively, came up with this idea of primary maternal preoccupation. Every healthy mother experiences it. Winnicott saw so much of it, he gave the process a name. Primary maternal preoccupation. And what it means, quite simply, is that a woman in late stages of pregnancy doesn't want to think or talk about anything but the baby. This seems obviously true in my brief experience. But it has an organic, a genetic, a biological dynamic. It isn't that the mother chooses just to talk about it. It's that it's almost hormonal, a genetic release of some kind. We're not clear of the mechanism, but it seems so universal as to suggest it's in fact biological. And it continues into the first month or two of a baby's life after birth. Talk to a mother with a 1-month-old child. What does she want to talk about? The odds are, if she's healthy, nothing but that baby's little life and its growth and what it's done today and how beautiful its little poops are and how fabulously it pees. One can get bored with this kind of talk, but it's inevitable around you young mothers. And if you recognize it for what it is, a healthy, appropriate mother focusing down on the needs of the child, you can be tolerant and in fact supportive. And it makes sense evolutionarily speaking. If, in fact, we've to some degree evolved, then those babies whose mothers had a little more of the tendency to care for them, care about them, focus on them, would have survived better to the point where it's become a universal form of female biology. What happens if it's an adoptive situation? Then primary maternal preoccupation does not exist, apparently. It doesn't exist at all in the genetic, biological way a natural mother feels or experiences. This might developmentally be somewhat of a problem that has to be recognized, because an adoptive mother may love the child, may focus on it quite a bit, but it's not equal. It's not the same as a mother in the midst of primary maternal preoccupation. And it isn't the same quite literally physiologically. When the child is born, it knows its mother already in the way the mother knows the infant. If the mother keeps the baby for a short period of time, the smell of the mother, the tone of the mother's voice, the rhythm of the mother's heart, and the feeling of the bodies coming together is a profound imprinting experience to the baby. sets up an identification that begins its psychological birth. If that is shifted, then there's trauma, and it has to begin again. If a baby is handed off among various folks, its mind never gets a chance to grow. It takes a single mother, not a single mother, it takes one mother focusing on that child's development. The baby becomes the person that the mother sees. It is that mother's consistent mental, emotional presence that forms the bedrock of the child's mind. One of my first supervisors said, the mother creates the self in the child. The father introduces that self to the world. We'll come back to that in a little bit, but I think that first part is absolutely true. So we have to do our best to recognize the biological preconditions for healthy growth. And if those conditions aren't met, we simply have to recognize it and do the very best we can. It won't do to pretend every mother is just as good as every other, because that simply is not true, and the baby's needs, if that delusion is maintained, cannot be effectively and appropriately met. Okay. Now that sounds like I'm being a little bit demanding of mothers, and I am. Winnicott had a name for it, because he came up with a lot of these names. He called it the good enough mother. You don't have to be perfect. It's not that high a standard. But to Winnicott, good enough mothering was a very high standard indeed. What he wanted to do, I think, was allow for the biological probability that most women are biologically capable of having children and being good mothers. And yet, in our culture, the way it is now, he saw that we don't have the kind of tribal environment where young women are exposed to children being raised, often assisting in the raising of their younger siblings or extended families. The great tragedy, it seems, in some ways, at least from the perspective of child development, is the very first baby a modern woman often holds is her own, and does not have an opportunity the way children have historically or in traditional societies to be with, to be around, to handle, to help raise multiple children before it's her turn to raise her own. So, good enough mother, I think, remains a critical idea. If we don't have the experience of mothering in early adolescence and childhood, of our mother mothering others and our aunts and uncles mothering and fathering other children around us that we can participate in, then we must ourselves learn how to be good enough fathers and good enough mothers. And that's the purpose of this lecture more than anything else. Good enough mother. Very high standard, focused on meeting all of the child's critical needs. Not neurotic, obsessive, compulsive, absolutist, narcissistic, not having to be the perfect mother. Down that road, everyone suffers. But certainly a very high standard with the child's needs in mind. I think Winnicott's ideas of primary maternal preoccupation and the good enough mother are absolutely essential to managing this process. Okay, so birth to 2 months, we have the autistic phase, poorly named. What happens then? Muller called it the symbiotic phase or symbiosis, from 2 to 6 months. That's when the baby starts realizing that there's it's dimly aware of a need-satisfying object, that there's something out there. Now, it is still felt to be a unity, still felt to be one. That's symbiotic. That's what symbiotic means. A dual unity within a common boundary. Freud called it this oceanic feeling, this feeling of oneness with the mother. Fabulous feeling, powerful feeling. And yet just slightly other, not quite, within one boundary, a dual unity. I've never heard it better than that, a dual unity. And at this point, what we have physiologically is an explosion of physical development. Not just the experience being taken in by the child of the emotional dynamic between the mother and itself, but memory, the cognition, motor coordination. The child is starting to move. The child is starting to develop a deeply complex neuronal circuitry. The neurons are expanding, and that, most importantly, their interconnections are expanding exponentially. If all of these physiological things are happening, if it's activated by love. And that's when we get back to what the British ended up calling hospitalism. When love is absent, few of the potentials for physiological growth and development are activated. Love is required to activate physiological growth. This may sound strange, but holding your baby is important. That, in fact, it's profoundly important to the formation of the child's mind. That connection to the mother, that physical holding, it becomes in some way what we call a symbiotic organizer of psychological birth. The physical connection to the mother, the physically being held, is, I think, metaphorically like the womb of the which causes the physical birth of the baby. The baby being held by the mother consistently is, in some ways, that psychological womb, slowly, out of which the baby's mind comes. Leave a child in a hospital bed for too long and it will die. Leave it in a crib too much of the day, it will not develop emotionally, physiologically, or psychologically. Researchers after Winnicott came up with the idea of the good enough holding environment. Now, this sort of backs up the camera a little bit. Yes, the mother is as important as Winnicott said, but of course the mother isn't there alone. I think you could also say there's no such thing as a mother. This is my little addition to the theory. If Winnicott said there's no such thing as a baby, Donovan Bigelow is going to say there's no such thing as a mother, because it's impossible to imagine how a mother can exist by herself with just the baby. It takes much more than just a mother alone to meet the fundamental needs of the child. Historically, we've had a present father doing that. Another thinker named Wilfred Bion came up with the idea of the container and the contained. Nothing fancy about that. It made a lot of sense first time I read it. The mother acts as a container of a womb, in effect, a psychological womb for the baby's psychological growth and ultimate birth. Who's containing the container? The mother can't contain the baby by herself and then get everything else done she needs to get done. It's very obvious that a mother needs to be contained herself. Historically, that's been the job of the father and the larger extended family. If the father isn't present, somebody's got to do it, or the child's needs can never be met. So container, contained. Mother contains, creates the self in the child. The father will introduce that self to the world later, or someone will. But the mother herself must have she's got to take a shower now and then, get the bills paid, get food on the table, get things organized, has other things to do, both in terms of personal self-care besides just childcare. And so she must also be contained. And I think that's what's meant by a good enough holding environment. Without that, the mother can't do her job adequately. Specifically, the baby's emotional life at this stage, the word is splitting. Freud came up with it a long time ago, and it's been used consistently in child developmental circles to describe how a baby very early on organizes its mind, how its mind is organized. I don't think there isn't a self there yet forming decisions. These things happen developmentally and on almost a biological basis. The baby does not have the sophisticated enough brain and a sophisticated enough mind to recognize that mom is a complex person and dad is a complex person, and some days they're in a bad mood and some days they're in a good mood, and you can forgive them for that because nobody's perfect. That kind of thought cannot come into a baby's mind. They have pleasure and they have pain. Their emotional responses tend to be quite global. When things are good, they're very, very good. When things are bad, the baby feels like it's in hell. if you watch a baby, you can see they almost flip a switch. They can be very happy in one moment, somebody slams the door, and they are shocked and traumatized and terrorized, and they scream as if they're going to die. And it doesn't take a child development scholar to look at a crying baby and realize the level of pain they're in. It's extreme. That runs against our culture, even recognizing that. We must recognize what's going on in the child's mind, and we can see the bliss in a baby's face at the end of a good feed, where the nipple just goes out of the mouth, there's a little drool goes down, and the baby's look on its face is absolutely angelic. It seems that's as close to heaven as we can get on this earth. And sometimes, sadly, and sometimes very quickly, that angelic little face can be contorted into screams of rage and fear and pain that are hard for us to even look at, much less know how to fix. And so we must understand that the baby's emotions are so extreme that we must take extra efforts to still and soothe the extremely negative ones. Love, being taken in, creates a mind. Pain being taken in, fear, anxiety, reject, neglect, abandonment. These are also taken in. The baby accumulates all their experiences, not just the good ones. And the only way to mental health is the accumulation and the experience of more love than hate. And one of my favorite old sayings, an old Native American saying, is that there are two wolves in every man's heart, love and hate. Which one wins? And the answer is the one you feed the most. And I think that's profound wisdom, because 50 years of Kleinian researches into child development says exactly that we have within us. We are a dualistic creature in some way. We have love and we have aggression. And we must take in more love or the aggression rises to the fore. If we take in more pain and suffering and fear and anger, then we take in love. That's going to be the core building blocks of our mind. And down that road is mental illness, without question. So toward the end of the symbiotic phase, if there's enough love built up, if the child's mind is starting to coalesce within that dual unity, what you find is wonderful, happy infants seemingly joyously living their lives. You could almost imagine what it's like to be this omnipotent creature in the baby's mind, which isn't connected to reality yet. If it's hungry, the breast appears. If it is slightly uncomfortable, it suddenly is now wrapped in warm clothes that are dry. The fantasy seems to be that the child controls this, that the baby has this omnipotent power to make all these things happen, to meet its own needs, when it really is just the ministrations of an attentive, devoted mother. This, when it's good, is, again, about as good as it gets on earth. The baby is as close to heaven as you can get in those good moments. And if all of that has gone well or well enough, we enter from 6 to 24 months a long period called the separation individuation phase. This is both an amazing achievement and also it's got some dangers to it. Margaret Mahler, and I don't know why she did this, she divided this one long phase into 3 subphases, and I apologize for the complex terminology, but it's the legacy of the research that we've been left with. So remember, autistic phase, 0 to 2 months, 2 to 6 months, the symbiotic phase, and now a long phase, separation individuation, broken into 3 subphases. The first subphase, hatching or differentiation. This one makes some sense, hatching. The baby comes out of its little symbiotic oneness with the mother. It's when the baby first starts getting an inkling that it's maybe separate from the mother. And you'll find babies at this stage, around 6 months, they don't just cuddle into the mother anymore. They push away, they look back. This is where babies, soon after 6 months, 6 to 8 months, they will look directly at you, and they're looking at you, and they're seeing eyes, and they have some sense of you as an external presence, and they're curious about you, and they're curious about the mother. They start exploring the mother's body. A younger baby just sort of sits there and is soothed and cuddled. But starting at 6 months, they start exploring. They want to feel the lips and the nose and the ears and the fancy earrings, and they will pull on them occasionally. And they explore the breasts, and that they're a lot of fun to explore. Most guys understand this. Sorry. And, and the baby is exploring the first thing it can explore, the mother's body. And then it starts exploring outside. It gets objects in its hands. Babies at this phase are fascinated by whatever the mother gives it. And the mother gives it all kinds of new toys that can be played with and manipulated. And where, of course, do they go? Right into the mouth. This is why Freud called the earliest phase the oral stage. He wasn't very creative with his naming, but it made some sense. The earliest phase, the oral phase, to Freud, was about the breast and about the things going in the mouth. It seemed to be the way children learn about stuff, and it seems true in this phase as well. This is the first time that a baby is recognized to acknowledge the existence of strangers, and that they have stranger anxiety is the phrase, that a baby will sort of recognize someone who they haven't seen before. That means they have started to recognize, to have memory. That means their brain structure has been complex enough to withhold images, to take in the object, take in the representation of someone and hold it in mind, to recognize them when they come back, or recognize that they haven't seen that person before and they have a certain reaction to that. Now, here's the first problem. All of this is good. All of this is developmentally appropriate. The child starts to pull away from the mother and do more. If the mother fosters that, it is in the infant's needs. But what happens if the mother has her own dependency needs? What happens if the mother interprets the baby pulling away as rejection of the mother? The mother's response in an unhealthy mother may be one of two things. Either smothering, oh no, baby, you can't go out there. It's too dangerous out there. You got to stay with me where it's safe. Or, you don't need me, I don't need you. Go ahead, see if I care. You don't care about me, I don't care about you. That sounds ridiculous, but I've seen it happen. And this is where the adult mental health question comes to the fore. I think up until this phase, most mothers are driven by biology. Most mothers are driven by this inevitable physiological as well as emotional experience. But as the child starts separating from them, if the mother isn't healthy, then some of their own insecurities come up, some of their own childhood developmental issues come up, and we start seeing the problem with the mother at about this stage, if we see one. Okay. What is a mother supposed to do at this stage of the game? And my response to that is quite simply, the mother is supposed to dance. This is a dance with your baby. In a dance, the partner comes in, the partner goes out. The baby, same thing. Starting to go out, you let it as far as it can. You stay emotionally connected, the baby will come back. The baby needs, it's in the baby's developmental needs to begin to separate from you. And that's going to be a loss to you, and it's a loss to the baby in some ways, but it's also driven by biology. The baby needs to explore. Life needs it to develop its strengths, and that requires getting beyond the symbiotic oneness with the mother. At this stage, if the mother can let it be a dance, let the baby's not going away, not running away, not being taken by someone else. There's room in the living room to let the baby move a little bit on its own if it can, and always be there. Phase 2, sub-phase 2, practicing. Again, this one's fairly obvious. What we find is that a healthy baby who's had its needs met up to now feels delight in movement. They go from sitting on laps to crawling to walking at some point, not particularly quickly or with much stability at first, of course, but they are so proud of themselves. If you see a baby the first time it stands up on the coffee table and standing on its own little 2 feet, you think it just conquered Everest. when you see its face, when it walks for the first few times, takes a few uncertain steps, a little bit hesitant, a little worry on its face, and then it stands and can move, there is glory in those first few stable steps. It's very exciting. Repetitions become important at this stage of the game. More fascination with things provided by the mother. And the child will start orbiting the mother, going out, coming back, going out, coming back. We call it emotional refueling. The idea that I think refueling is probably a good way to describe it. The baby goes out and it gets tired and comes back. The baby goes out, gets a little afraid, feels like it's a little too far away, not so secure, comes back to the mother. And also still has a little bit of that omnipotent control, a little bit of that I'm in charge of the universe idea. One of my favorite, I saw it today at the park. There was a little girl, I think she was about 15, 16 months old, maybe a month or so older. And her father, it was her mother first, was hiding behind a tree. And she would jump out from behind the tree. And the little girl would giggle and giggle and giggle, and the mother would go back. And she would look a little bit, and the mother would come out behind the other side of the tree, and the little girl would giggle, and she would wave her arms and stomp her feet and jump up and down. It was so exciting to see the mother. And then she would do it again, and this went on until the mother was exhausted. Well, you've all seen variations on that theme, the peekaboo game. If the child puts its hands over its own eyes in front of its mother, and then laughs and giggles when it sees its mother and does it again. First of all, if you do that and cover your face, and let the baby see you, and cover the face, and let the baby see you, what does the baby do? Giggles and giggles and giggles and laughs. Why? There's nothing funny about it. It's not a joke. But why does that child this morning at the park, and why do babies do that all the time? And why will they keep doing it till your arms fall off? I think it has to do with, in their little minds, a fantasy of omnipotent control. It isn't just mother here with the hands over her eyes. It's mother gone, and I bring mother back. I make mother go away. I bring mother back. Can you imagine how cool that is? If you're a child, to have the power to bring mother back whenever you want her, oh my God, I'd giggle myself. I'd be so excited. That would be so much fun. I could do that forever if you'd let me. We're now starting to think about what's in the child's mind, these fantasies, these ideas, these representations of the mother, and their relationship with them. Children at this phase will be able to play catch me if you can. You've all seen it, I bet. Child runs, the mother follows, the mother catches, and the child wants to get put down, and then runs again. And the mother goes gets it, and the child's giggling the whole time. Catch me if you can. They need to be caught, and they need to be let down. They need to know that there's someone going to catch them, that they're not just going to run out into the universe. That would be too terrifying. They need to be caught. But they also are exercising their autonomy for the first time within the bounds of that being caught, and they love that autonomy, that power. The great German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, "We are will to power." He didn't hold with all this developmental stuff. He just thought we were the will to power. And I gotta say, in child development, there's a lot that seems like that in there. Children love to feel powerful. They love to make mommy go away and come back. They love to feel the freedom of running the first few times. And then they get bicycles, and then they get motorcycles, and I'm not sure it changes. Again, what is the mother and father's response to this next level of independence and autonomy? The best way I could describe it is empathic delight. You don't push the child away farther than they can go. You don't lock them to you out of your own anxiety. Empathic delight. A gentle push and emotional contact. That allows the child to internalize a sense of its own confidence. The child doesn't get confidence from its own efforts. It gets confidence from taking in the mother's experience of love and care and presence and strength and the gentle movement that gets it going out there. So maybe this is one of the most poignant examples of how a child gets stronger. It has to have a strong mother there allowing it to do this dance, this separation, practicing, movement, strengthening, and then refueling back to the mother as it needs. A gentle push and emotional contact equals the child's internalizing confidence. I've never heard it better than that.